So a student walks into Philosophy 101 and the professor says, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is once you graduate, you'll never lose an argument again. The bad news is nobody will ever know it. I'm Pat Flynn and this is Philosophy for the People. So if you found that story to be a little bit funny, it's probably because you detected a kernel of truth in it. It seems like we've lost the ability to debate. It seems like the art of the argument has seriously devolved. Most of the time when we're arguing with people, we think of an emotional disagreement. We think of a fight with our spouse or on social media, where we're really not trying to hash out an intellectual position, but rather we're trying to just prove ourselves right. And we tend to make a lot of wild assertions or accusations or personal attacks. But that's not what we mean by argument in philosophy. In philosophy, an argument shouldn't be avoided, but encouraged. Because in philosophy, an argument is simply giving reasons to support a conclusion. So let's talk about how to make a good argument even if nobody knows it. Okay, so let's get clear. What exactly is a good argument? Well, at least to me, a good argument is any argument where the conclusion is more probable than its negation. So in philosophy, we use what is called a deductive argument, where we lay out a series of premises to support a conclusion. So to have a successful argument, we really only need the premises and the conclusion to be more plausibly true than not, to lay the grounds upon which we can rationally affirm the decision. This doesn't mean that we have to have absolute certainty. Philosophy isn't geometry, and most decisions we make in life aren't done out of absolute certainty. Think about it. I am pretty sure that my wife loves me, and I'm pretty sure if I walk outside of the gym, I won't get sucked up by a tornado. But I can't prove it to the highest possible degree. I'm not absolutely certain. But I have good reasons, and I have good evidence, so I'm going to go ahead and affirm the conclusion that my wife loves me and that I won't get sucked up by a tornado if I leave the gym. Arguments in philosophy, I think, need to have a similar standard. We need to have the right expectations of what a good argument is before we can have any idea of how to make a good argument. So one more time. To me, a good argument is simply any argument where the conclusion is more probable than its negation. So in philosophy, I said that we often use a deductive form of argument. Now, a deductive argument includes a series of premises and a conclusion. Now, a premise, as we said, is simply a step in the argument. And the conclusion is what follows, assuming that the premises are 1, sound, and 2, the logic is valid. So sound premises simply means that the statement or proposition is true. And valid logic means that if the premises are true, the conclusion follows unavoidably. We can't escape it. So to have a successful argument, we need to have both 1, sound premises, or a series of statements that are propositionally true, and number 2, reasoning whereby the conclusion follows unavoidably from the premises that we've laid out. Let's give you an example. Here's an example you'll run into in most beginning philosophy classes. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates was a man. Conclusion, Socrates was immortal. So we can see in this very simple syllogism that if the premises are true, if we agree that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, we cannot escape the conclusion that Socrates is also a mortal. So this is a good example of an argument, I think a very good argument, if not a great argument, where we can affirm beyond a reasonable doubt that the premises are more plausibly true than not, which leads us to a conclusion that is also more plausibly true than not. That's all we need to have to make a good argument. Now let's take another look at some arguments that might not pass this test. Premise 1, all goats are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates was a goat. Conclusion, Socrates was immortal. Now, believe it or not, the logic in this argument is valid. If we affirm the truth of the premises, the conclusion follows inescapably. We can't avoid it. We would have to say that Socrates is immortal. But it seems like there's a problem with premise number 2. I think we have pretty good evidence to suggest that Socrates was not, in fact, a goat. So we can successfully avoid the conclusion and affirm that this just isn't a very good argument. Now, note this. It doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. Socrates may very well still be immortal. All we can say is that we can't affirm that he is immortal based on this argument alone. Okay, let's take one more example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, you are a man. Conclusion, we should plan ahead for your funeral. Now, this seems to have premises that are true, but the question we have to ask is it logically valid? Does that conclusion necessarily follow from the truth of the premises? And upon reflection, I just don't think that it does, because even if I accept that I'm mortal and am going to die someday, that doesn't mean that I want to plan ahead for my funeral. Maybe I want to be cremated. Maybe I don't want a funeral. So this is a classic non sequitur. That means that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. So we can say that the premises are true, but the logic is invalid and therefore deny the argument. So this has been a basic, and believe me, very basic introduction to the art of the argument. But before we get deeper as we move along in the series, let's take a minute to think, why is this important? Why should we study how to make a good argument? Well, I can think of a couple of reasons. Number one, so we're not taken advantage of, so we don't fall for nonsense, right? I mean, so much of what goes on today, especially in the political sphere, it's just not an argument. It's not a good argument. So the job of a philosopher, the goal of being a philosopher, should be able to take somebody's assertions, to be able to take what somebody says and pull out the premises and see if you can form a syllogism. See if you can line their premises up and analyze it in a very, analytical way, to be a little bit redundant, to see, are these premises true and do they support the conclusion that the person is making? This is a fantastic intellectual exercise, and it will really help you to objectively either affirm or deny a claim independently of the person who's making it. It's important to remember that a lot of times you might like somebody and you might want to agree with somebody, but they might be making a very bad argument. It's also important to remember the reverse. You might really dislike somebody, but they could be making a really good argument. So philosophy helps you to finely tune your BS detector, if you will, to not only be able to pick out those bad arguments and reject them soundly, but also, beyond that, to be able to make good arguments yourself. And perhaps even more importantly, learn when to keep your mouth shut. Because part of being a good philosopher is also knowing what arguments not to make.